يسعدني ان احنا نبتدي دلوقتي الجلسه الثالثه في هذا المؤتمر. طبعا واضح المستوى العلمي الذي توفر لهذا المؤتمر، فطبعا شكرا جزيلا للاستاذ الدكتور هشام والدكتوره الدكتوره رانيا الفضاء، فعلا الناس المنظمين والمشاركين يعني بصراحه مستوى علمي هايل جدا. I enjoyed it. تحس يعني ايه اللي هو بيقولوا عليه مش هتقدر تغمض عينيك، قاعد على طول مجرد طول
احنا CBC افلام بقى.
هو الحقيقه مش هطول عليكم. هنبتدي دلوقتي الجلسه على طول. هنبتدي لان احنا اوريدي وي ار ليت نص ساعه عن التايم. يعني اتس ليت but it's not too much late بالنسبه للمؤتمرات الثانيه. هنبتدي بالاستاذ الدكتور بروفيسور Arlin B. He's going to speak to us a physiological dose about cardiovascular transition at birth. It's something that's important. يهمنا كلنا. تفضل. Okay.
Thank you again for the introduction and invitation to come here and speak today. So I'm going to talk to you again about sheep and some experiments that we've done, but I think it has some relevance for clinical care, especially with start thinking about delayed cord clamping. I have no conflicts to disclose, unfortunately, for my retirement account. So I'm going to talk about what are the independent effects of oxygenation versus umbilical cord clamping on cardiovascular transition at birth. How does cerebral blood flow respond to birth? And how does cerebral blood flow respond to hypoxia immediately after birth? Remember this morning I showed you how cerebral blood flow increases in the fetus in response to hypoxia and in the newborn, but what about right after birth? So why am I interested in studying the birth transition? As a physiologist, we like to put a little bit of stress on normal systems and see how they respond. That's kind of how we figure out how things work. And birth is like the ultimate physiological stress. There's probably no bigger cardiovascular transition that any of us go through in our lifetimes than what happens to us if we go from being a fetus to a newborn. So you have the obvious changes, as you know well, of the very low lung blood flow before birth, changing to getting 100% of the right ventricular output, and the disappearance of blood flowing across the foraminal valley and the ductus arteriosus, the loss of the placental circulation. All of these things happen within minutes at the time of birth. And so as a physiologist, we see that as a big stress on the system, and that gives us the opportunity to start to look for where things might be not working the way that they should be. All right, so that was my simplified diagram of that. I'm going to explain a little bit more by stealing a diagram from Satyan Lakshman-Narasimha, who is a very leading researcher in the United States on the effects of delayed cord clamping, and also a much better artist than I am. This is the diagram he uses to describe what happens with immediate cord clamping. And so the point that we make here is that before you clamp the cord, there's this umbilical venous return, which comes back to the heart through the foraminal valley and becomes a significant amount of left ventricular preload. And there's very little blood flow through the lungs to contribute to left ventricular preload. So it's important to have the umbilical return in order to maintain ventricular output as a fetus. If you clamp that cord without establishing pulmonary blood flow first, you lose a significant amount of that preload, and that decreases left ventricular output. At the same time, when you clamp the cord, that stimulates a catecholamine response, an angiotensin response. A lot of vasodilators disappear from circulation. And so you get a big increase in systemic blood pressure, and that increases the afterload on the left ventricle. So at the same time, you're decreasing the preload, you're also increasing the afterload when you do an immediate cord clamp without waiting for the pulmonary blood flow to be established first. You compare that to giving some time to allow for the pulmonary blood flow to increase before you clamp the cord. By ventilating the lung, you do two things. One is the mechanical stretch of the alveoli opens up the capillaries. A lot of the capillaries in the fetal lung are kinked and not able to carry blood flow. Once the alveoli inflate, they get stretched out, opened up, and that increases the overall diameter for blood flow in the vasculature of the lung. The other thing that happens is you get oxygen into the lung. And oxygen in the pulmonary vasculature is a potent vasodilator. So again, you're increasing lung blood flow if you ventilate the lung before clamping the cord. So by doing that, you can establish lung blood flow, which contributes to the left atrium, left ventricle, ventricular preload. And you can get that established before cutting off the umbilical circulation, which will have a decrease in the left ventricular preload. So that's the idea with delayed cord clamping and how it might assist with the cardiovascular transition. We would expect to see less fluctuation in arterial blood pressure because you're able to maintain left ventricular output by establishing lung blood flow first. So in my lab, we decided to study this in a kind of drawn-out fashion. I call it birth in slow motion. And we've taken fetal sheep. These are near-term fetal sheep that I'll be showing you. We've subjected into this protocol where we do a C-section. We instrument the animals so that we can measure arterial blood pressure, and we put a flow probe on the carotid artery. So it's a little bit different than the flow probe I talked about this morning, but it's measuring flow through the carotid artery, about 70% of which goes to the brain. And so after we surgically instrument the animals, we get a stable baseline period, and then we begin ventilating them. The ventilation is just simply to expand the lung. We're doing it with a gas mixture that does not change their fetal arterial blood gases. So by doing this, we can see just the effect of ventilating the lung without changing blood oxygenation. And then the animals get divided up into one of two different protocols. One group gets oxygenated. So while we are ventilating them, we simply turn up the FiO2 and bring their arterial blood gases up to normal newborn levels without clamping the cord. And the other group, we clamp the cord, but we turn up the oxygen just enough to keep them at fetal blood gases, but now they're without the placental circulation. And then we do, in the first group, after this is about 20 to 40 minutes, so very drawn out. I should just say more than 20 minutes. We then clamp the cord in those oxygenated animals so that we can see what's just the effect of clamping the cord on the physiology of birth. And in the other group, after 20 to 40 minutes, we oxygenate them so that we can see what's the isolated effect of oxygenation. And then after that, we deliver the animals. So this whole time that we were doing the study, they're still in utero. They're not getting the effects of the temperature changes and the loss of the surrounding amniotic fluid pressure. So here's what the blood gases look like in these two groups of animals. The first group, they in black, they are the ones that get oxygenated first, and we can see that their fetal arterial PO2 increases from the 20s up to something over 200. So we wanted to make sure that we got them well oxygenated. We gave them 100% oxygen, which is obviously not what you would do in a baby, but that's what we wanted to do for this physiological study, to make sure that we were getting them well oxygenated. The other group maintains a normal fetal PO2, even though we've clamped their cord. So the green ones, they got the umbilical cord clamped here, but we've turned up the oxygen just enough to keep them at a fetal PO2. And then here, the green group finally gets oxygenated, and this one in the black group, here is where we finally clamp the cord. And then we decrease the FiO2 to bring them to an arterial PO2 of 70 to 90 millimeters mercury for the rest of the experiment. You can see if you look at the arterial PCO2, when we start ventilation, we did blow off some carbon dioxide. We tried to bleed in a little bit of carbon dioxide, but we weren't successful in preventing that from falling altogether. So there is some decrease in carbon dioxide, and then it continues to decrease for the rest of the experiment. There's no significant difference between the two groups in the carbon dioxide levels. So here's what the blood pressure looks like in this experiment. You can see in the green group, these are the ones that get the umbilical cord clamped, but there's no change in arterial blood gases. And there's a very large increase in systemic blood pressure with just simply clamping the cord, as you're probably aware. So that's where you get the catecholamine release, angiotensin drops in a lot of the vasodilators that come from the placenta. And in the black group, that's where we are oxygenating these animals, but they still have the placental circulation intact, and there's actually no effect on systemic blood pressure with just oxygenation. Then here, when we oxygenate the group that has lost the umbilical circulation, there's no effect on the systemic blood pressure, versus this group, which is now already oxygenated. Finally, here we're clamping the cord, and we see an increase in blood pressure. So the take home here is if you oxygenate the animal, you don't really affect systemic blood pressure. It's clamping the cord that has the effect of increasing systemic blood pressure. Heart rate did not change very significantly throughout the whole group, or the whole experiment, and there was no significant difference between the two groups. Okay, when we look at carotid blood flow, there's a little bit different story here. So when we start ventilating animals, as I mentioned earlier, the CO2 levels decreased a little bit, and we also saw a decrease in the cerebral or the carotid blood flow during that time. So I think this is probably associated with a little bit of hypocapnia from blowing off carbon dioxide. But the big difference between these two groups comes when we clamp versus oxygenate the animals. So the animals that get the umbilical cord clamped demonstrated an increase in carotid blood flow. Remember, these are the animals that had the big increase in systemic arterial blood pressure, versus the animals that get oxygenated but still have an umbilical cord intact. They see a dramatic decrease in cerebral blood flow. And then over here, when we oxygenate the animals that have lost the umbilical circulation, that's when we see a decrease in their carotid blood flow, versus the animals that were already oxygenated. When we clamp their cord, there's a slight increase in their cerebral blood flow. Okay, so are these changes in cerebral blood flow the result of systemic blood pressure changes pushing the blood up into the brain, or is it because of changes in the cerebral vascular resistance? We can calculate that from this equation. Resistance is pressure divided by flow. So if I do that calculation, you get a graph that looks like this. As we're ventilating the animals and blowing off some carbon dioxide is a vasodilator. Blow that off, you get some cerebral vasoconstriction. That's what this increase is here. And then when we oxygenate the black group, you see the large increase, a rapid increase in cerebral vascular resistance. So it's oxygenation of the animal that causes the cerebral vasculature to constrict, versus clamping the cord, which had a dramatic effect on systemic blood pressure, has almost no effect on the cerebral vasculature. Okay? And the reverse is true when we do those events later on in the study. It's the animals that have lost the umbilical circulation. When we oxygenate them, we see an increase in cerebral vascular resistance. And the animals that have already been oxygenated, when we clamp the cord, there's no significant change in the cerebral vascular resistance. So the take home is that cerebral vascular resistance is affected mostly by oxygenation as opposed to clamping the umbilical cord. So what about that increase in cerebral blood flow that happens during hypoxia that we talked about earlier this morning? As I mentioned, that if you expose these fetal animals to hypoxia, they respond by increasing their cerebral blood flow by 25, sometimes 30 to 40%, which redirects blood flow from the systemic circulation and tries to maintain oxygen delivery to the brain. So we get this relationship between arterial O2 content and cerebral blood flow. The lower the arterial O2 content goes, the higher brain blood flow goes. This is the normal relationship that we expect to see in fetuses and newborns. But nobody's really looked at this right around the time of birth, when all of these dramatic cardiovascular changes are happening, when we have that strong cerebral vascular constriction that I just showed you. This is a list of all the studies that have shown that the brain blood flow goes up during hypoxia. That's been demonstrated from late in the second trimester through to 15 days after birth, but it's not been studied during the perinatal period. So I've got here graphs that show the fetal response to a hypoxic episode compared to these newborn animals, which are about 1 to 2 hours old, just after the experiment that I showed you earlier. So we decreased the inspired FiO2 in order to lower the brain tissue PO2. In the case of the newborn animals, we're lowering it from a level of about 40 millimeters of mercury, which is normal for an adult or newborn, down to just under 10 millimeters of mercury. And the blood pressure response, as I mentioned earlier this morning, the fetus responds to hypoxia with an increase in systemic blood pressure. Most of this is mediated by sympathetic activation. Interestingly, the newborns respond to that same hypoxic stimulus with a decrease in arterial blood pressure. So this is where you have to think about that they've already had the umbilical cord clamped, they've already kind of maxed out their sympathetic response, which you get when you clamp the umbilical cord. And maybe the only thing that's left is the hypoxic vasodilation that is intrinsic to a lot of the vasculature in the body. Cerebral blood flow, as I showed you earlier, increases in the fetus in response to hypoxia, but these newborns are unable to increase their cerebral blood flow in response to this hypoxic insult, possibly because they're unable to increase their arterial blood pressure. But what about cerebral vasculature or cerebral vascular resistance? The fetus, as I showed you this morning, has kind of a variable response, but for the most part, it's believed that it has a decrease in cerebral vascular resistance in response to hypoxia, compared to these newborns where there's virtually no change in cerebral vascular resistance in response to hypoxia. So we find in these newborn animals that hypoxic cerebral blood flow increase is pretty much absent immediately after birth. I'll show you this. We've started putting near infrared on the animals after the study. And just for your information, in case you're interested in whether or not near infrared might be useful, we find it to track our brain tissue PO2 probes very closely. And it's a very reliable indication of how much oxygenation is going on in the brain in our sheep experiments. So what's different about the cerebral blood flow immediately after birth that might account for this lack of ability to increase brain blood flow? Well, it could be any of the long list of the things that I've mentioned already in this talk. So as you ventilate and oxygenate the brain, you're lowering CO2. The oxygen causes a profound vasoconstriction of the cerebral vasculature. The brain tissue PO2 itself is increasing 3 to 5-fold as you go from fetus to newborn. When you clamp the umbilical cord, you're increasing the circulating vasoconstrictors, you're increasing sympathetic output, you're decreasing a lot of the vasodilators that circulate. And so it could be any one of these things or a combination of them that somehow stuns or at least temporarily limits the ability of the newborn to respond to hypoxia. If we try and put these together into thinking about how it might tie into delayed cord clamping and how what benefits or harm it might have to the brain, I try to think of the events that happen before clamping the cord, where you would begin ventilation, you would increase the arterial PO2, that gives you the pulmonary vasodilation, increases lung blood flow, gives you the left ventricular preload to maintain this more stable blood flow, systemic blood flow. That increase in arterial PO2, as I just showed you, causes a decrease in brain blood flow. It does not decrease the brain oxygen delivery. So there's more oxygen in the arterial blood. You don't need as much of it to go to the brain. And perhaps that cerebral vasoconstriction has a protective effect if you can establish that before clamping the cord, which is when you get the increase in the vasoconstrictors and vasodilators and more large fluctuations in systemic blood pressure. So So the summary of this would be that the sequence of birth-related events can have dramatic effects on brain blood flow. Increased arterial oxygenation at birth results in cerebral vasoconstriction. Responses of cerebral blood flow to hypoxia are altered during the immediate postnatal period. And again, I have to thank a lot of people in my lab, and I'll show you how we maintain our sheet. This is not a sheet in one of my studies.